Well, hello again, students. I remain Mr. Laskowski, your devoted teacher and the host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. If you are watching this at 2.0 speed or while using your telephonic device for some non-scholarly purpose, slow it down to 1.0 and put the phone away. Great notes require careful and close attention, and great notes are the keys to great scores, both on your test and on the AP exam. And today's presentation is all about progressivism, the idea that we are capable of constant improvement. So improve yourself by getting and staying focused from this moment right through to the end. Okay, let's get into it. The Progressive Era, a time in which Americans looked at the modern world they had created and wondered, can't we do better than this? And a time in which Americans looked to their government and said, you must do better than this. So you might ask, what was so wrong with the Gilded Age? Well, if you happen to be rich and successful industrialist, then nothing. Nothing at all was wrong. The problem was that only a tiny sliver of that population was so lucky, and virtually everyone else, from our friend Cletus the farmer to factory workers in Carnegie's steel mills to African Americans trapped in a debt spiral in sharecropping, everyone else was left out. To say nothing of the 100% of women who had no meaningful voice in the formation of laws that affected them, their families, and their bodies. Or boatloads of immigrants who arrived each month expecting a land of opportunity, but instead finding themselves stuck in crowded, disease-ridden tenements. Yeah, like the golden frame, it might look beautiful on the outside, but if you scratch the surface, something uglier, dirtier, and more dangerous was lurking just below. And the political system seemed rigged too, because it was rigged, keeping rich and powerful people rich and powerful and locking everyone else out. Was this truly the way the framers of the Constitution expected things would turn out? Well, many of them were pretty powerful themselves, so perhaps. But for the rest of America, this image, with its grotesquely proportioned trust owners drawn in the shape of money bags, and the senators like tiny puppets on strings controlled by the industrialists, and the people's entrance barred and locked, all of this was a big problem. A big problem that needed a big solution. But what would it be? This. If the previous cartoon oversimplified the problem, perhaps this one oversimplifies the solution. The arrival of Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency didn't suddenly change the American economic and political system, but it would change somewhat eventually into something more fair and more truly representative of the people's will. But let's take a closer look at this image. It has its origin in a bear hunting trip that President Roosevelt took in Mississippi in 1902. After trekking all day and not finding a bear of his own to kill, TR's assistant captured one and then tied it to a tree, and then invited the president to kill it. Thinking this unsportsmanlike, TR refused to kill the bear. And when the story got reported in newspapers, an enterprising candy shop owner decided to start selling stuffed bears, calling them Teddy's Bears. And thus, the stuffed animal that probably comforted you when you were a baby was named after this man who ushered in the Progressive Era. And he's just as cuddly. With that frame of reference, look closer. TR hasn't gone on a bear killing spree any more than he would go on a trust busting spree. Instead, he has killed a bear that was a bad trust, and he's leashed and restrained a good trust. And the other little bear in the background, he's just a hard-working bear, not subject to being hunted. In other words, a regular rule-following corporation. I really like this cartoon because it shows President Roosevelt, even with his huge head, as a person who favored balance, moderation. Neither a reactionary nor a radical, more like a trapeze artist keeping everything in perfect balance. And balance is what it's all about. Behold the fulcrum. Or if you never took physics, behold the seesaw. If you think back several months to when we were talking about the writing of the Constitution, I might have shared this image with you. It depicts the tension inherent in creating a limited government. In the words of James Madison, you must first give the government the power to control the governed, and in the second place, oblige it to control itself. That is, we need to create a government that is strong enough to do its job, for protecting us, providing basic services to us, but not so strong that is able to take away our natural rights in the process, life, liberty, and such. And so, in essence, we need to maintain a balance between the strong central government that Thomas Hobbes envisioned and Alexander Hamilton proposed, and the weak government that protected natural rights, envisioned by John Locke and supported by Thomas Jefferson. A government that is too strong or too weak would either be oppressive and subject to revolution or incompetent and subject to revolution. Perhaps this is why Theodore Roosevelt said, "Liberty without order and order without liberty are equally destructive." See what I mean about TR being a moderate, one in favor of balance? And the reason this is the central question in American history is that in our democratic system, each of us is entitled to answer this question according to our own beliefs and experiences. And there are times at which we might say, I need more rights. And so you might push the seesaw toward the red side. And then we might say, oh, we need government to solve a problem. And so we might push it back toward the blue side. And essentially, that's what every election is about. Do we need more or less government at this point? So I hope you'll remember this when it comes time for you to vote in your first election. You learned this skill back when you rode your first seesaw. So let's see how these moves toward and away from strong central government played out over time. And what you'll discover is they sort of ebb and flow like waves, or as a math student told me about 15 years ago, they're like sinusoidal curves, whatever those are. And indeed, they kind of are. What this reveals is, as a nation, we have gone through periods of more government and less government, like when Washington asserted national supremacy and Hamilton created a national bank, or when Jefferson pushed back against that, adding territory to the Union but shrinking the size and scope of the military. Ebb and flow, rise and fall. More government when Polk was in power, and then a deep trough before the Civil War, back when we needed strong leadership and instead got Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. The Civil War and Reconstruction were obviously times when the government was strong and used military might to assert national supremacy and to protect the liberties of newly freed people. And finally, an even longer and deeper trough called the Gilded Age, when government was less and did less, allowing business to run amok and southern states to create Jim Crow laws that oppressed people. And so now, at the turn of the century, I think it's time for a resurgence of national governmental power. And I'll even put a date on it, 1901, when the Curse of Tecumseh struck again, killing off President McKinley and ushering in the age of Theodore Roosevelt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's take a minute to think about why the Progressive Era happened when and how it did. Because it didn't spring like Athena fully formed from the head of Zeus, there were signs of it. And the first of them was the fact that people were increasingly disaffected by what we might call politics as usual. That is, corruption, graft, scandal, and everything bad. The scandals of the Grant administration, along with the fact that James G. Blaine, the tattooed man you see here, won the Republican nomination and very nearly won the presidency in 1884. Couldn't we just have a politician who wasn't so obviously corrupted by power and money? And it wasn't just at the national level that corruption in politics seemed to be out of control. We saw how single party domination of southern states allowed the creation of white supremacist Jim Crow laws, but party bosses also controlled many state and city governments as well. The most famous of these, Tammany Hall in New York City, allowed a few unelected bosses to control local politics, exchanging money and services for political loyalty. And this led to a system that looked and felt every bit as corrupt as it was. Indeed, local politician George Washington Plunkett went so far as to defend this kind of corruption, calling it honest graft. And here's how he described it. My party's in power in the city, and it's going to undertake a lot of public improvements. Well, I'm tipped off that they're going to lay out a new park at a certain place, and I buy up all the land I can in the neighborhood. Then the board of this or that makes its plan public, and there's a rush to get my land. Ain't it perfectly honest to charge a good price and make a profit on my investment and foresight? Of course it is. Well, that is honest graft. Well, when people saw political insiders like Plunkett using their position to enrich themselves, they made the call for political reform, and it made that call grow louder, both in the cities and across the country. And perhaps this is why late 19th century saw the rise of so many third parties, groups that saw Republicans and Democrats as Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, and thought there has to be a better way. And that's how groups like the National Greenback Party, the People's Party, and even the Socialist Party rose to prominence. Of course, prominence doesn't mean power, and we saw how Democrats co opted the populists in the 1896 election. But clearly, there was some real demand for a different approach to politics. But if corruption in politics helped usher in the progressive era, so too did corruption in big business. And by this, I mean the unchecked, unregulated, and untaxed business practices that allowed for the emergence of such huge corporations, combinations, and trusts. As the rich got richer, those who were left behind continued to suffer. And they suffered because of low wages, because of terrible working conditions, and the knowledge that they could always just be replaced by someone else. Or if they tried to unionize, that business leaders could always just call upon the government, which would always, always, always side with management. Indeed, this disparity between wealth and poverty took a particularly deadly turn in the Johnstown flood of 1889. Carnegie, Frick, and other wealthy Pittsburgh industrialists bought an old abandoned lake and dam so that they could have a posh getaway from the grime of the city. There they hunted and fished for several years, but never bothered to properly repair the leaky dam, which meant that when a particularly heavy storm came in 1889, the dam burst and sent water rushing down through the formerly bustling city of Johnstown. Over 2,200 people were killed in the flood downriver, victims of the industrialists' need for leisure and their unwillingness to pay to properly maintain a dam. And here's the thing. It's not as if government didn't exist or that it didn't have the power to regulate interstate commerce. It totally did have that power. It just didn't use it, which is why this building is the perfect metaphor for governmental inaction during the Gilded Age. It's one of my favorite buildings in the world, and it's just a good softball throw away from the White House in Washington, D.C. When it was built in the late 19th century, it was meant to hold the Departments of State, War, and the Navy, essentially the entire executive branch. And the offices were filled with political appointments that had made President Garfield the target of an assassin. And yet, despite the huge size of this building and the fact that hundreds of people had cushy jobs inside, what exactly was this government doing? What exactly were all of those people doing inside that building? Well, that was harder to define, which is why this building is very much a metaphor for the age. On the surface, it looks big and impressive, full of people and action, but if you scratch the surface, you'll see that most of the things that people needed government to do were being left undone, just the way the industrialists wanted it. Pro tip, if you are in Washington, D.C., please do not literally scratch the surface of this building. You will be arrested. And yet, for all of those people filling government offices, the social problems were bad and growing worse by the year. With more and more people shoved into crowded city tenements, the dream of rags to riches came face to face with the reality of rags to rags and more rags until you die. The kids on the right here seem to be getting some fresh air, but look at their front yard. It's the elevated tracks of a transit line. And the kid on the left has a look on his or her face that I can't pinpoint. Is this, yay, I get to have my one bath of the week? Or, oh my God, it's miserable having a bath in a kitchen sink in a cold water flat where I'm clearly the last person to get a bath, which explains why the water is unbelievably cold and unbelievably dirty. No wonder families stuck in these tenements tended to get sick more often without the time or money required to get healthy. And no wonder kids couldn't use education as a way to lift themselves out of poverty because so many of them had to take jobs just to help their families survive. And just in case we'd forgotten, the old scourge of alcoholism just wouldn't go away. We've already seen members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League work to address the problem, but the country needed a lot more Carrie Nations and a lot fewer pubs and taverns if the country was ever going to smash the bottle and get sober. And the longer people had access to alcohol, the greater the likelihood that crime, poverty, and domestic violence would continue to plague the nation. Of course, these were just some of the social problems. Rights for women and immigrants and African Americans were all still unresolved. Urbanization and industrialization had led to overcrowding and disease and pollution and an increasing gap between rich and poor. And now, because the frontier had closed in 1890, each new boatload of immigrants or train car load of farmers moving to the city was adding pressure inside the container with no safety valve of new Western lands to relieve the pressure. So, what would happen to the container? Would it blow up? Or could we do something to bring down the pressure? That, my friends, is the question. But there's one last reason why the progressive era happened when it did and how it did, and that's timing. First, you need to remember that the middle part of the 1890s was a time of economic depression in the United States. One of our great historical truths is political and economic stability are linked, which means that when times are bad economically, there's going to be a great demand for a political change, which there was. Second, this time period was another one in which people of faith recognized that faith without works is dead. And looking around, there were so many places where works of charity were exactly what was needed. And so the social gospel movement was born, worrying less about converting souls and more about helping the so called least of these. The role model for this movement was the Good Samaritan, who helped people in need regardless of their religious beliefs. And in this way, the social gospel was essentially an extension of the northern wave of the Second Great Awakening from half a century earlier, one focused on making earth as it is in heaven and helping to lift up the less fortunate people. And the movement had two great spiritual leaders, Pope Leo XIII, who said that it was the duty of rich people to care for the poor, and this man, Walter Rauschenbusch, a minister from the seminary in, you guessed it, Rochester, New York, who reminded people that loving your neighbor as yourself meant recognizing that every member of your community, rich or poor, is your neighbor, all of which fostered an environment of working communally to solve the nation's problems. And examples of this include charitable organizations such as the YMCA and the Salvation Army. But quickly they realized that the problems were even bigger than private charities could solve on their own. We needed governmental action, the kind we would get in the progressive era. Another important consideration is the fact that late 19th century saw a remarkable growth in the literacy rate of Americans. This fact, coupled with the technological developments in the printing industry, led to a huge expansion in the numbers of newspapers and magazines and journals that were produced, distributed, and widely read. As a result, reformers could get the word out to ever increasing numbers of people, who could then, in turn, demand action from their government to address these problems. Well, the final piece of this puzzle has to be the untimely death of William McKinley and the rise to power of his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt. McKinley, reelected in 1900, a year that ends in zero, decided to attend the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. I think you know where this is going. While shaking hands with guests in the music hall at the exposition, McKinley was shot in the gut by Leon Czolgosz, who is usually described as a deranged anarchist. At first, the wound wasn't thought to be fatal, but when the bullet couldn't be located and removed, infection set in, and eventually gangrene set in, and after 2 weeks of suffering, McKinley died. So, where was his vice president at this time? Hiking in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, of course. When he left for the trip, TR had been assured that McKinley was recovering. But McKinley's health took a serious turn for the worse, and so a search party had to go and find Vice President and bring him back to Buffalo. And you can retrace the steps of his frantic journey out of the mountains and into history. But be sure to stop at this plaque, which commemorates the place where TR was at the moment of McKinley's death. Now, the ascension of Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency at the robust age of 42 changed everything. Now, the country was being led by an active, energetic president who believed in the positive good that government could do for the people. And that, probably more than anything else, is why I like to say that the Gilded Age ended and the Progressive Era began in September 1901 with the rise of President Theodore Roosevelt. So, if the stage was set for a new era in American history, who would help alert leaders to what was needed to be reformed? Well, that job fell to a group of people we've come to know as muckrakers, who were journalists and novelists using media to raise people's awareness about the social problems in society. These folks believed that government should use its power liberally in order to address these problems. And all that sounds fine, but where did the term muckraker come from? Well, it was a term popularized in the book Pilgrim's Progress, in which workers helped to clean the dirt roads in towns by raking up the horse dung and mud to make the surface safe and smooth again. And in commenting on the works that these journalists and reformers were doing, Theodore Roosevelt said, "The men with the muckrakes are often indispensable to the well being of society, but only if they know when to stop raking the muck." Again, we see the way TR sought balance, not too little, not too much, just enough. If workers didn't clean up the muck, the roads would be dangerous and impassable. But if they dug too much, they'd create big holes in the road, making it every bit as dangerous and impassable. Balance between too much and not enough. That's what TR was seeking. Now, the first great muckraker, the one who made it possible for the others to get the word out, was magazine publisher Samuel McClure. His magazine provided a forum for muckraking journalists to publish their stories and to show readers both what was wrong with society and what needed to be done in order to address these problems. When Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens needed a place for their stories, they sought out McClure's magazine. And speaking of Ida Tarbell, she wrote first for McClure's magazine, but later compiled her writings in an expose called A History of Standard Oil, in which she exposed the company's corrupt and or illegal business practices that had allowed Rockefeller to build Standard Oil into the behemoth that it became. Now, we should consider Tarbell's point of view here because her father had been in the oil industry but got financially ruined by Rockefeller. So Tarbell might have had an axe to grind, but she did do the work and she brought the receipts, so to speak. And so her conclusion was Rockefeller and his associates did not build Standard Oil in the boardrooms of Wall Street banks. They fought their way to control by rebate and drawback, bribe and blackmail, espionage and price cutting, by ruthless efficiency of organization. And Tarbell's book is thought of one of the single most important works of investigative journalism ever, and it helped lead to the eventual breakup of Standard Oil. Well, part of the problem with getting people in power to promote social change is they can't necessarily see what they haven't been shown. And so photojournalist Jacob Riis took it upon himself to show people in their fancy houses and luxury apartments just how dirty and disgusting conditions were in the tenement houses and slums just on the other side of the city. Appropriately, he called his book How the Other Half Lives. And it certainly shocked readers with its stark portrayal of the lives of folks whose hard work generated the wealth for the upper class. Riis also sought to capture the authentic, unscripted truth, which is why he became one of the first photographers to use flash photography. And this allowed him to sneak into tenement houses and capture life, such as it was, totally unscripted. And the results were sometimes jarring. Look at how many people are living in one room here. At least six, no windows, a communal bathroom down the hall. The smell must have been awful, and overcrowding made tenements a breeding ground for disease. One of Riis's most famous images was this alley scene. Just imagine you've managed to leave the tenement, put in 10 or 12 hours at the factory, and then in order for you to get back home, you need to go down this passageway. The scene is menacing, with the man in the bowler hat looking like he's ready to pounce. Another man carries a stick, either to take your money or to knock out your teeth. People are gathered on the stoops and looking out their windows, ready to see the next victim try to pass by. It's a wonder Riis was able to get this picture taken at all. And the whole area was dirty and run down, dangerous and overcrowded. This, this was how the other half lived. This man looks like he's sleeping in an oven, but it's just that the only place he can find a rest is in a doorway on dirty mattresses resting on barrels. This, too, was how the other half lived. And we always like to say that children are the future, but look at these kids. What kind of future could they possibly have, huddling together for warmth outside a basement apartment? And yet, this was how the other half lived. Shoddy construction meant that even homes and boarding houses were dangerous. This one looks like the boyhood home of Ron Weasley. Indeed, this was how the other half lived. Riis's stories and photographs helped promote the idea that governments needed to help improve building codes and provide better housing and transportation for the poor people in the cities. You know, I like to mention when a book changes the world. Uncle Tom's Cabin was one, the influence of sea power upon history was another, and The Jungle is one too. Written by Upton Sinclair, this is a novel, so you might be tempted to dismiss it as just another work of fiction. But Sinclair did enough research into conditions in the meatpacking industry that his story, although fictionalized, had enough of the ring of truth to disgust, to enrage, and to motivate politicians to clean up the industry. And it's not that meat inspections didn't exist. There were such thing as meat inspectors. It was just a lot cheaper for companies just to pay off those inspectors rather than make the expensive changes that would ensure that the meat would be safe. And so here's a short excerpt that sort of gets to the point. I hope you haven't just had lunch. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor and in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. That's tuberculosis. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. The rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, the bread, and the meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat, even if he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. Reportedly, when TR read The Jungle, he was so nauseated and incensed that he started pushing for the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the FDA, which today ensures that the meat that you get at Wegmans is safe to eat. So let's pause here for a quick snack before we continue with the second half of this presentation. I hope you've been taking great notes, or at least making progress at taking great notes. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you on the other side of the screen.